Picture yourself as a 15-year-old princess in Vienna, 1666. The morning light filters through the palace windows, casting shadows across your face, a face that reflected the long history of dynastic marriages. Your jaw protrudes slightly, making it difficult to chew. Your spine curves in ways that make sitting painful. Your breathing comes in shallow gasps because your rib cage didn't form quite right, but these physical ailments pale compared to the horror that awaits you this afternoon. Your ladies-in-waiting dress you in wedding finery, their hands trembling as they fasten pearl buttons down your back. They know what you know. They've known since you were born. Today, you are to be married to the Holy Roman Emperor, a dynastic arrangement planned since your early childhood. You've met him only a handful of times, this man who was a close dynastic relative, and each meeting left you feeling hollow with dread. Your name is Margaret Theresa of Spain, and you're about to become another casualty in the Habsburg Dynasty's obsession with keeping their bloodline pure. What makes your story particularly tragic isn't just that you're being married off within the family under dynastic pressure, it's that everyone knows exactly what this marriage will do to you. The court physicians have already predicted your fate: difficult pregnancies, sickly children, and an early death. But the political alliance between Spain and Austria matters more than your life ever could. The practice of close-kin dynastic marriage wasn't just accepted in Habsburg circles, it was actively pursued as a strategy to consolidate power and wealth. Margaret Theresa's marriage to Leopold wasn't an anomaly, but part of a carefully orchestrated pattern that had been destroying royal women for generations. To understand her specific nightmare, we must first understand the twisted logic that created it. The Habsburgs believed their blood was literally different from that of common people. They saw themselves as divinely appointed rulers whose genetic material was too precious to dilute with inferior bloodlines. This wasn't mere arrogance. It was a fundamental worldview that shaped every aspect of their lives, from politics to religion to the most intimate family relationships. Consider the marriage negotiations that sealed Margaret Theresa's fate. She was born in 1651 to Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria. Already, the genetic damage was compounding. Her parents were closely related within the dynasty, making her the result of a close dynastic marriage before she even drew her first breath. When she was barely able to walk, diplomats were already discussing her eventual marriage to her uncle Leopold, who was eagerly waiting for his child bride to mature. The court painter Diego Velázquez captured Margaret Theresa in a series of portraits that unwittingly document the progression of her genetic deterioration. In the famous painting Las Meninas, she appears as a small child, already showing signs of the Habsburg jaw and the characteristic bulging eyes. Later portraits reveal a young woman whose beauty is marred by increasingly obvious deformities, the price of generations of inbreeding made visible on her delicate features. But Margaret Theresa wasn't just a victim of genetics. She was a victim of a system that viewed young women as breeding stock, valued only for their ability to produce heirs and cement political alliances. From the moment of her birth, every aspect of her life was controlled by men who saw her not as a person, but as a political asset to be deployed at the appropriate time. The preparations for her marriage began when she was 13. Court officials started what they called her education, but what it really meant was preparing her psychologically and physically for marriage to a man old enough to be her father, a man who was considered a close dynastic relative. She was taught that this was her duty, her honor, her sacred obligation to the dynasty. Ladies-in-waiting instructed her in the intimate duties of marriage, though they couched their lessons in euphemisms and religious language. They told her that suffering was noble, that bearing children for the empire was the highest calling a woman could have, that her personal feelings were irrelevant compared to the needs of the state. They never mentioned that Leopold had already lost one young wife, another victim of Habsburg inbreeding who had died in childbirth along with her baby. The wedding took place in 1666 when Margaret Theresa was 15 and Leopold was 26. The ceremony was a spectacle of imperial grandeur, with representatives from across Europe attending to witness this glorious union. Poets composed verses celebrating the match. Musicians created special compositions. Artists were commissioned to capture the happy couple in paint and marble. But beneath the golden vestments and behind the fixed smiles, everyone knew the truth. The bride could barely stand through the lengthy ceremony due to her spinal problems. The groom's own physical deformities, his massive jaw, his difficulty speaking, were hidden behind royal regalia and careful positioning. The wedding was celebrated with grandeur, though the weight of dynastic duty overshadowed the moment. We can only imagine Margaret Theresa's anxiety as she faced her new life as Empress. 15 years old, in chronic pain from her various ailments, she was married to an older royal relative she barely knew. The court physicians had prepared her with treatments meant to ensure fertility, various medical treatments and religious rituals common to the era. None of them addressed the fundamental horror of what was about to happen. Leopold, for his part, seemed to view his niece bride with a disturbing mixture of dynastic duty and genuine affection. Court observers noted that he was excessively fond of his young wife, lavishing her with gifts and attention that might have seemed romantic if not for the grotesque context. He commissioned portraits, wrote her poetry, and, by all accounts, tried to play the role of devoted husband. But no amount of silk gowns or pearl necklaces could disguise the essential perversion of their relationship. The pressure to produce an heir began immediately. The entire Habsburg Dynasty's survival depended on these genetically damaged individuals somehow producing viable offspring. Margaret Theresa's body, already compromised by generations of inbreeding, was subjected to the further strain of repeated pregnancies. Court physicians monitored her constantly, documenting every detail of her reproductive health with clinical precision. Her first pregnancy ended in miscarriage, an unfortunate but not unexpected result. But the court treated it as a failure, a disappointment, a sign that perhaps the young empress wasn't trying hard enough. The physicians subjected her to increasingly invasive treatments designed to strengthen her womb and purify her blood. The treatments were torture disguised as medicine, but Margaret Theresa endured them because she had been taught that her suffering served a higher purpose. The successful pregnancies that followed were hardly more fortunate. Of the 4 children she managed to carry to term, only one survived to adulthood. She watched infant after infant succumb to the genetic devastation that was their birthright, each loss a tragic reminder of the risks of close dynastic marriages. The court blamed her, of course. Whispers followed her through the palace halls. Perhaps she was cursed. Perhaps she wasn't pious enough. Perhaps she harbored secret sins that God was punishing through her children's deaths. But Margaret Theresa's tragedy extended beyond her role as a failed breeding machine. She was also trapped in a marriage that modern observers would recognize as deeply controlling and restrictive by modern standards. Leopold controlled every aspect of her life: whom she could see, what she could read, where she could go. He was pathologically jealous, flying into rages if other men so much as looked at her too long. His love for her was the love of an owner for a possession, not a husband for a wife. Court records from this period paint a picture of a young woman slowly dying from the inside out. Margaret Theresa became increasingly withdrawn, spending hours in prayer, barely eating, rarely speaking except when protocol demanded it. Observers noted her melancholic disposition and nervous complaints, but no one connected her mental state to her circumstances. Instead, they attributed her decline to her weak Habsburg constitution, as if her genes, rather than her situation, were to blame for her misery. The physical toll of repeated pregnancies on her already fragile body was catastrophic. Each pregnancy left her weaker, more prone to the respiratory infections that plagued the Habsburg line. She developed what court physicians described as hysteric fits, probably seizures brought on by the stress and genetic damage. Her famous beauty faded quickly, replaced by the hollow-eyed exhaustion of a woman being slowly destroyed by the demands placed on her body. By her 20th birthday, Margaret Theresa looked and moved like a woman twice her age. The girl who had once danced at court balls now could barely walk without assistance. The princess who had charmed ambassadors with her wit now rarely spoke above a whisper. She was dying, and everyone knew it, but the pregnancies continued because her duty to produce heirs superseded her right to survive. Her final pregnancy in 1673 placed enormous strain on her fragile health. Already weakened by 6 years of constant childbearing and the accumulated effects of generations of inbreeding, her body simply couldn't handle another pregnancy. Court physicians warned Leopold that another pregnancy could kill her, but the emperor's need for more heirs outweighed his concern for his wife's life. Margaret Theresa spent her final months in severe decline. The pregnancy was difficult from the beginning, complicated by her existing health problems and the fact that the child, like all Habsburg children, was born of a close-kin dynastic union. She was confined to bed, unable to eat solid food, struggling to breathe as the pregnancy advanced. Ladies-in-waiting took shifts sitting with her, listening to her labored breathing and fervent prayers. When labor finally began, it lasted for 3 days. 3 days of difficult labor that court physicians struggled to manage. The child, when it finally arrived, lived only a few hours, another tragic loss in the Habsburg line. Margaret Theresa, exhausted beyond human endurance, developed a fatal postpartum infection. She died on March 12, 1673, at the age of 21. The official cause of death was listed as childbirth fever, but the real cause was the systematic destruction of a young woman by a system that valued bloodline purity over human life. She had been married within her royal lineage for 6 years, had endured 4 pregnancies, had buried 3 infants, and had never known a day of genuine happiness or freedom in her short life. Leopold mourned her publicly and extravagantly, commissioning elaborate funeral monuments and dedicating religious foundations to her memory. But his grief didn't stop him from remarrying within a year, this time to another young relative who could continue the Habsburg breeding program. The cycle continued, as it had for generations and would for generations more. Margaret Theresa's story, horrifying as it is, was not unique among Habsburg women. Her sister, Maria Theresa, had suffered a similar fate. Married to Louis XIV of France and subjected to the same demands for repeated pregnancies despite clear genetic damage. Her daughters, who survived to adulthood, were parceled out to other European courts, where they too became victims of dynastic breeding programs. The Habsburg women lived in gilded cages, surrounded by unimaginable wealth and power but possessing no control over their own bodies or destinies. They were dressed in the finest silks, adorned with precious jewels, housed in magnificent palaces, and gradually broken by the very system that claimed to honor them. Their portraits hang in museums now, beautiful testimonies to artistic genius that hide the ugly reality of their subjects' lives. What makes these stories particularly tragic is how preventable the suffering was. By the 17th century, observant courtiers had noticed the pattern. They could see that each generation of Habsburg inbreeding produced more damaged offspring. They documented the increasing rates of infant mortality, the physical deformities, the mental instabilities. Yet the practice continued because political power mattered more than human suffering. The court physicians who attended these women knew the truth but were powerless to speak it. Their medical records, preserved in imperial archives, show their growing understanding of the connection between close marriages and genetic damage. They wrote in carefully coded language about weak constitutions and inherited maladies, never quite stating outright that the imperial family was destroying itself through inbreeding. Even the Catholic Church, which could have refused to sanction these incestuous unions, chose political expediency over moral authority. Papal dispensations for close-kin dynastic marriages were readily granted to royal families, often in exchange for political favors or financial contributions. The same church that preached about the sanctity of marriage and the sin of incest made exceptions for those powerful enough to demand them. The victims of this system weren't just the women forced into these dynastic unions, but their children as well. Those who survived infancy often lived short, painful lives marked by physical and mental disabilities. Charles II of Spain, the final product of generations of Habsburg inbreeding, was so severely affected by generations of close kin unions that he struggled to function. His inability to produce an heir finally ended the Spanish Habsburg line, but only after centuries of preventable suffering. Modern genetic analysis has revealed the full extent of the damage these marriages caused. The Habsburg Dynasty's family tree looks more like a family web, with the same individuals appearing multiple times as both ancestors and descendants. By the time of Margaret Theresa's generation, the genetic coefficient, a measure of how closely related parents are, was higher than it would be for children of brother-sister incest. These weren't typical marriages. They were high-risk dynastic unions with devastating consequences, with young women serving as unwilling test subjects. The men who arranged these unions knew the likely outcomes but proceeded anyway, valuing abstract concepts like dynastic prestige over the concrete reality of human suffering. The psychological damage inflicted on these women extended beyond the obvious trauma of forced incestuous relationships. They were raised in an environment that normalized the abnormal, that taught them their suffering was noble, that convinced them their only value lay in their ability to produce heirs. They were denied the possibility of normal relationships, normal sexuality, normal lives. Some Habsburg women tried to resist their fates, but their options were severely limited. Running away meant abandoning everything they knew and facing a world that had no place for disgraced princesses. Refusing to marry meant potential imprisonment or exile. Even attempting to control their own reproduction through crude contraceptive methods of the time risked accusations of witchcraft or treason. The few who found ways to exercise agency did so in small, often tragic ways. Some developed mysterious illnesses that prevented consummation of their marriages. Others found solace in excessive religious devotion that provided an excuse to avoid their husbands. A few formed romantic attachments to courtiers or servants, risking everything for a glimpse of genuine affection. Margaret Theresa's death at 21 made her one of the luckier ones in a perverse sense. She didn't live to see all her children die or to endure decades of reproductive abuse. She didn't survive to become one of those hollow-eyed Habsburg matrons whose portraits show women aged far beyond their years, women who had buried child after child, women who had been reduced to their reproductive roles for dynastic continuity. The palace where she lived and died still stands in Vienna, now a museum where tourists admire the Baroque splendor and marvel at the wealth of the Habsburgs. The guides speak of imperial glory and artistic patronage, of political alliances and military victories. They rarely mention the young women who paid the price for all that grandeur, whose bodies were broken on the wheel of dynastic ambition, whose lives were sacrificed to the god of blood purity. In the palace chapel where Margaret Theresa was married, where she prayed for deliverance that never came, visitors now take photographs and admire the gilded angels. They don't see the ghost of a 15-year-old girl trembling at the altar, don't hear the echo of her whispered vows to an uncle who would become her destroyer, don't feel the weight of centuries of women's suffering that permeates those sacred stones. The Habsburgs weren't unique in their practice of close intermarriage, but they perfected it to a degree that shocked even other royal families. They turned inbreeding into an art form, a political strategy, a religious duty. They created a system where young women like Margaret Theresa had no choice but to participate in their own destruction, where resistance was impossible and compliance was barely survival. Today, we look back on these practices with horror and disbelief. We wonder how an entire civilization could have normalized such obvious abuse. We comfort ourselves with the thought that we're more enlightened, that we would never allow such systematic exploitation of the vulnerable. But the forces that created Margaret Theresa's tragedy, the elevation of abstract principles over human welfare, the treatment of women's bodies as political resources, the willingness to sacrifice individuals for perceived greater goods, haven't disappeared. They've simply taken new forms. Margaret Theresa died over 350 years ago. But her story remains relevant because it reminds us what happens when power operates without compassion, when tradition trumps humanity, when political expedience matters more than individual suffering. She stands as a warning from history about the cost of treating human beings as means to an end rather than ends in themselves. Her portrait in the Kunsthistorisches Museum shows a young woman with large, sad eyes and the distinctive Habsburg features that marked her as both royal and doomed. Visitors pause before it, perhaps struck by her beauty or the magnificence of her dress. Few realize they're looking at a tragic victim, destroyed not by a single person but by a dynastic system that prioritized power over well-being. This is the truth behind the fairy tale of princess brides and royal weddings. This is what lies beneath the gilded surface of imperial history. Young women like Margaret Theresa, forced into close dynastic unions, forced to bear children their bodies couldn't support, forced to suffer and die for the sake of bloodlines that were already poisoned beyond redemption. Their names deserve to be remembered. Their stories deserve to be told, not as romantic tragedies or historical curiosities, but as testimonies to the human cost of systematic oppression. Margaret Theresa of Spain was not just a Habsburg princess or a failed breeding vessel. She was a young woman who deserved love, happiness, and the right to control her own body. She received none of these things, and her fate stands as an indictment of the system that destroyed her. Margaret Theresa's life was cut short by the traditions and expectations of her dynasty. Margaret Theresa did not simply die young, she was consumed by a system that valued bloodlines over human lives.